Welcome to Chapter 2 of State and Local Government. We're going to be talking about the topic of federalism today. Federalism is about sharing power between the state and regional governments. It's about the question of who has the power to do what. There are a number of definitions of federalism. Here's one I like. The power of government which the Constitution distributes authority and power between central government and smaller regional governments. So both national and state governments have substantial powers and responsibilities, including the power to collect taxes and enforce laws. There are a number of advantages and disadvantages of federalism. Some are real obvious. An advantage is it allows experimentation. A disadvantage is it might lead to conflict because laws aren't uniformly enforced, or there are different regulations. Think about gun laws between West Virginia and Maryland, or between Illinois and Indiana. Some might not be as self-evident. One advantage can be the checking the growth of tyranny. What does that mean? Well, it means that for example, a national leader might be in charge of the national government, but there are a lot of independent people who hold power across the states who aren't necessarily of the same party, of the same political affiliation as the president, for example, and they're pushing back, right? So it's not like everybody gets in line. Just to make it clear, federalism is not the only way to organize power. We also have unitary systems of power, confederal systems of power, and of course federations. So we are going to be focusing on the federal systems because this is what the United States operates under. The states are a large focus of our discussion in this class. One obvious benefit of state government is that, theoretically at least, states are more responsive to citizens. People can actually get to know their local delegate or representatives. Remember that across one of the peculiarities of our system is that while every state has a system of representation, a state house, etc., they're called, that is, they're politicians who are in that state house are called different things in different states. So, sometimes it's a state senator, sometimes it's an assembly, it's a state assembly. They're called differently. How did we get this federal system? Well, as the book goes into it in some detail, we had problems with the Articles of Confederation, which was the first system of government in the United States. These problems led to the establishment of the Annapolis Convention. The Annapolis Convention did not actually produce a government, but it was sort of the precursor to the meeting in Philadelphia that ended up producing the U.S. Constitution. Once we have this system of government, there are a number of challenges, right? How do we balance the power between the national power and the state powers? The Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, gives some guidance in this matter, but I want to emphasize that the balance of power is not decided once and for all. The final arbiter, of course, is the Supreme Court, but the philosophy and opinions of the Supreme Court varies. It varies over time, right? So you have different courts deciding one way in 1898 and quite differently in the 1940s, for example, when segregation and begins to be challenged, successfully challenged in the Supreme Court. Prior to the 1940s, the Supreme Court routinely deferred to the states and said, hey, if you want to discriminate against any class of people, that's your business. We have nothing to say about it. So these balances change over time, right? The guiding light really is Article 6. This is one of the key articles to remember. Article 6 is the so-called supremacy article. This states very clearly that the U.S. Constitution is the final rule book. You know, everybody has got to play by the U.S. Constitution. If a law does not fit with the essentials of the U.S. Constitution, then it is not constitutional and it is invalid. That said, there are a number of powers that are given to the states. You find these these powers talked about quite a bit in the 10th Amendment, and then sprinkled in the Constitution as a whole. Issues such as the full faith and credit clause, you have the privileges and immunities clause, and again, these get argued over in Supreme Court cases. When we talk about different types of federalism, I think it's important to understand that these are different understandings of federalism that are often grouped consecutively, right? The sort of historical period. So this is dual federalism, sometimes talked about as a layered cake, where you have separate jurisdictions between the state and federal governments. As a practical matter, this ended up giving more power to the states, right, and a weaker central government. So it is in this period that we have, for example, acceptance of Jim Crow laws and acceptance of abuse of civil rights in the South. This is just routine. Also, the inability of the federal government to do anything about child labor or to do any sort of national planning. The Supreme Court, during this period, long period, tends to defer more towards state governments as a rule. Cooperative federalism begins roughly with the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, the New Deal. We have this creation of federal programs, more ambitious programs. Centralized federalism is you might think of it as the war on poverty. It's federal programs such as food stamps and block grants, more assistance to the local governments being offered by the federal government. The federal government takes a leading role. And with the administration of Ronald Reagan, we see more sort of a reduction of the role in the federal government, the national government, right? More inclination to give block grants. Right now, it's hard to categorize. Obviously this current administration is very much, people are still trying to figure out how to characterize things, although right now there are some key efforts by the Trump administration to dismantle, in large part, what is sometimes called the safety net. So to remove any sort of assistance to people, the working poor, and this is it's hard to know how to characterize this particular period that we're in, and I suppose that's usually the case. We usually don't know how historians are going to refer to our period. That's life, right? So it's a very transitional period we're in right now. The whole fight against terrorism was, on one hand, caused a increase in the powers of the federal government, the national government. On the other hand, there is also this inclination to dismantle social programs, and that would be more consistent with a smaller role of the federal government. Again, the federalism often comes down to the courts. These are a number of cases that you'll have to be familiar with. Obviously, one of these first ones, McCulloch versus Maryland, key in establishing a role for the federal government in national economic policy. But these court cases often are inconsistent from court period to court period, right? So what do you need to know? You need to know advantages and disadvantages of federalism. You need to have an understanding about how this works on the ground, so to speak, that this is an area that is arbitrated in the courts, starting with the local and working all the way up to the Supreme Court. And right now, it's uncertain what sort of federalism we are in right now. That's just sort of the way it is.